All right, so I'm going to share with you the overview of what I would like to talk about. And is there? Yes. Can you see it? All right. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I will talk about the following. I will start by looking back at how Germany moved from technological leadership to where we are today. Then I will describe where we stand now. I will use Palantir case as a concrete example of how we currently make technology policy decisions in Germany. I will then talk about the framework for deciding what we really need to build ourselves, and then I will discuss structural obstacles that prevent us from executing and what very concretely needs to change, and then conclusions. So I would like to begin with the past. Germany's technological heritage is impressive. And in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we were not just participants in technological change. Germany was leading. German companies were at the forefront in many areas, like electrical and mechanical engineering and pharmaceuticals and automation technology and automotive industry and more. And when the world wanted to know how to build something well, they looked to Germany. We set the standards. We exported not only products, but a way of thinking about engineering and innovation. And when computers emerged in the mid 20th century, Germany was again a key player. Names like Siemens, Nixdorf, AEG, Telefunken, they were leaders, and these were serious engagements within emerging technologies. The infrastructure was in place, the talent was there, and the investment was made. And for a moment, we had a genuine chance to shape the computer age, just as we had shaped the industrial age. And then something changed. So the crucial point is this: it is not that others succeeded. It is that we made strategic decisions, some explicit, some or many implicit, that took us out of the race. And all of those pioneering companies, they closed their computer divisions or disappeared entirely. Some merged, some lost the race, some simply stopped trying. Why is that? The standard narrative says, and what we also heard previously, is that American companies won and German companies lost. That is true, but that is not a complete story. The full story about German choices, mostly the choices were made about the risk, about the proper role of business, about what counted as respectable economic activity. In the 70s and 60s, the American entrepreneurs built venture-backed startups with high tolerance for failure, and German business culture valued stability, proven models, manufacturing excellence in established domains. We also heard, and it's still like this, that bankruptcy carried a strong social stigma in Germany. The idea that a company might fail, that investors might lose money, and that this could be acceptable or even necessary for progress sat quite uneasily in German thinking, and still is. Our industrial tradition was built on perfection, permanence, and not on iteration and creative destruction. And meanwhile, companies that did emerge in the United States, Microsoft, Apple, IBM, Intel, and later Google and Amazon and Meta, they operated in a system that rewarded risk-taking. They accepted failure as part of learning, and they directed capital into highly ambitious, high-risk projects that might fail completely, but can also change the world. And they did shape the digital world. They set the standards, they captured the value, they built the ecosystems. but Germany made different choices. We did not fall back because we were incapable. We fell back because our economic and cultural systems were and still are structured differently. And it is not entirely a weakness. Those systems created real stability, worker protections, and sustainable businesses, but they also came with a cost. We largely did not participate in the digital transformation that reshaped the world. And that was 70 years ago. And we are still managing the consequences. And these are consequences of our own choices, not simply of American success. So this is not a story of total collapse. We retained important strengths. Our industrial control systems with Siemens and Bosch, they remain globally competitive. SAP became a global player in enterprise resource planning, and Infineon is a leading manufacturer of power and automotive. We have contributed to open source projects like Linux and LibreOffice and Apache Flink, and we still produce excellent engineers and we still conduct world-class research. And these are real assets. But there's a critical distinction. The successes, they're mostly about sustaining legacy strengths and niche excellence. They are not about leading the digital transformation that is reshaping the world. SAP, for instance, is dominant in ERP, but ERP is a relatively narrow slice of the global software market. Siemens is strong in industrial automation, but it does not define the future of computing. Our open source contributions are real, but marginal compared to the ecosystem leadership the United States has achieved. So we are very good at implementation and excellent at optimization in known domains. We're not leading in innovation or in strategic technological direction. So the question we face now is whether we will repeat the same pattern or whether we will make genuinely different choices. In addition, we are currently living through another transformative moment that we also heard about before, the artificial intelligence. And it is only the beginning of its revolution in how we work and how we learn and how we create and how we govern. And the window to enter the leadership tier is still open, but it is closing, and we must decide. Do we want another 70 years of consequences like after the computer age? Or do we want to act differently now? And if we want to act differently, what exactly must change? And so let's go to point 2 now, about where we stand today. And this is the slow transformation and severe dependencies. So before we talk about the future, we have to be honest about the present, and we have to understand the present situation. And Germany faces two challenges that pull in different directions. So on the one hand, we move slowly in digital transformation, and on the other hand, we're deeply dependent on technologies developed and controlled elsewhere. And so let's start with the first challenge, the slow digital transformation. If we walk through, or if you walk through many German companies or public administrations, you will see something that looks like the 90s. So digitalization or digital tools, they exist, but the fundamental transformation, how processes work, how value is created, how organizations operate, that transformation has been very slow. And take as an example administrative digitalization. In 2017, Germany enacted the Onlinezugangsgesetz. This is the online access law with an ambitious goal to digitalize 575 government services across all levels of the government. Uniform, available online, and citizens do not have to retype the same information again and again. So Denmark did this, by the way, and this is very feasible. 7 years later, only 29 and between 29 and 45% of the services are digitalized, depending on the state in Germany. Why is that? It is not because our engineers cannot build it, but because of rigid legal frameworks, lengthy procedures, complex coordination between federal and state governments. But this is not a technical failure, it is a governance failure. Another example, perhaps, is the electronic health record, something that sounds simple and almost obvious. In Germany, it took more than a decade to introduce. Other countries did this years ago. Again, the barriers were not technical incompetence, they were structural. Deep concern for data protection, the need for consensus among healthcare providers, regulatory caution, and also approval processes that take simply too long. And in Germany, we focus exhaustively on risks before allowing progress. We create extensive participation procedures. Authorities interpret requirements with extreme caution, and nothing moves quickly. And I want to be fair, this is not accidental. It reflects really the values we care about, privacy and participation and responsible risk management. But there is a trade-off. If you pursue this without regard for speed or efficiency, these values come at a cost to our digital capability, to our competitiveness, and our ability to compete in AI and digital transformation. So we can choose to accept these costs, but we should at least acknowledge them instead of pretending that they do not exist. And the hurdles in digital transformation was the first challenge. And the second challenge is the dependencies that I mentioned. Germany has become deeply dependent on digital technologies developed and controlled outside of Germany, but not all dependencies are equal. So we heard previously that there are a lot of dependencies in Europe, but as it applies to Germany, also it applies to other countries. Not all dependencies are equal. It is very crucial to differentiate and distinguish between them. And let me explain to you the separation in three layers, perhaps. First is a cloud computing, I guess. And cloud is the basic infrastructure of the digital economy. The market is dominated by three American companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. German and European alternatives exist, but they are smaller, they are more expensive and less capable. So our dependency here is moderate. It restricts choice, but it is relatively reversible. You have alternatives, you can migrate data, you can switch providers, and the switching costs, of course, they are real, but they're not catastrophic. So you're not locked in forever. The second layer of dependency, I would say, are the frontier AI models. And here's the story is different. Control of foundational frontier AI models means control of a core capability that will reshape every sector. Whoever develops these models decides which problems are solved and what applications become possible. And at the moment that these models are they are dominated by the American companies, OpenAI and Google and Anthropic and Meta, and also with Chinese companies catching up quite fast. As a comparison, maybe Germany's largest foundational model, Luminous Supreme from Aleph Alpha, has 70 billion parameters, and GPT-4 is estimated at about 1.76 trillion parameters. So the gap is really not trivial. Larger models, they can capture more patterns, they can handle more context, they can make fewer errors, and we are not building competitive frontier models in Germany. When Germany wants cutting-edge AI, we depend on others. And once these models are deeply integrated into our system, that dependency becomes very hard to unwind. The third layer of dependency is semiconductor manufacturing. And this is perhaps the deepest layer because computing depends on chips. And advanced chips depend on manufacturing, which is concentrated in Taiwan and South Korea, and constrained by US export policy towards China. Germany does not manufacture the advanced semiconductors required for training large AI models. We depend on others for the basic commodity of the digital age. And this dependency is not something you fix in 5 years. It is almost irreversible without decades of investment. So there are really different types of dependencies. And these two challenges, the dependencies and the slow digital transformation, they define where Germany is today. We need a strategy that can do two things at the same time: accelerate digital transformation at home and reduce those critical dependencies that really matter for strategic autonomy and are expensive to reverse. We must improve the speed and quality of digital transformation in administration, in industry, and society. We must decide which dependencies we must resolve to maintain meaningful digital sovereignty and which we can accept as normal in an interdependent world. For future or for full digital autonomy, or perhaps full digital autonomy, is not a realistic goal for Germany or for Europe for that matter. We do not have the funds, we do not have the people, we do not have the resources to build every layer ourselves. And even if it were technically possible, it would not be desirable. And as we heard before, every country depends on other countries to some extent. But research is global, and the best ideas come when researchers work together across borders. And if Europe tried to build a purely European IT stack isolated from international collaboration, we would end up weaker, not stronger. We would sacrifice collaboration in order to avoid a largely theoretical purity of independence. So this is where we are today. We transform too slowly and we rely deeply, but in different ways, on digital technologies that are controlled elsewhere. And the next question is, how do we currently make decisions about such dependencies? And for that, let me turn to this concrete example of Palantir in the next point. So to understand how Germany currently makes technology policy decisions or how we should think about dependency and risk, let me briefly discuss the case of Palantir. And this case is interesting not because Palantir is uniquely important, but because it shows how emotional reactions and political narratives often drive policy instead of systematic risk and cost analysis. So what is Palantir, maybe first? It is an American company that built data integration and analysis software. It is for police forces. Its product, Gotham, does something simple in principle. It integrates data from different police databases and lets officers search for connections. So technically, Gotham does nothing the police could not do manually: query databases and compare results and search for patterns. The difference is speed and scale. And with today's data volumes, complete manual analysis is practically impossible. Since 2017, the police in Hesse, this is my home state, have used Hessen data based on Gotham, and the results are very concrete. The prevention of terrorist attacks and investigation of serious crimes, solved cases. Now Bavaria and North Rhine-Westphalia also use Gotham, and Baden-Württemberg approved it just recently. And these are operational decisions by police forces that find the tool useful. Now, despite this, Gotham faces persistent criticism, and the main fears are worth examining briefly. The first one is is it constitutional at all? Does integrated data analysis violate international, in Germany, does it violate German self-determination. In 2023, the Federal Constitutional Court said Hessen data creates a significant informational advantage and therefore needs stronger legal safeguards. And the law was tightened, but the court didn't say that Hessen data was unconstitutional in principle. So the core question is not if Palantir is an American system. The core question is, do integrated police databases from any provider comply with German constitutional law? Second fear is the theft of confidential data. Three theoretical channels are mentioned in this respect. So first, misuse of maintenance channel. In secure operation, such channel does not exist. Updates flow one way through data diodes. Then second is hidden, or second concern is hidden outbound channels built by Gotham, but Gotham is run in specially secured data centers accessible only from police networks. Building undetected unbound channels there is extremely hard. Then general cyber attacks on police networks that could then also abuse the ability of Gotham to analyze large volumes of data. But this is a cybersecurity problem which is independent of Gotham. So if Gotham is operated as recommended, that German data in German data centers and access only for cleared personnel, then the risk profile for data theft is not fundamentally different from that of other integrated systems. Now, the third fear, and perhaps one of the strongest one, is Peter Thiel and the ideology. So Peter Thiel, he's the co-founder and chair of Palantir, and he's a Trump supporter with libertarian views. And some argue that because of this, Palantir cannot be trusted. But it would be interesting to compare this with IBM's I2 analyst's notebook. This is a similar tool which is also used by German police, and IBM is perceived as politically neutral and serious. So it is, however, also equally subjected, like Palantir, to US law. It also sells to governments worldwide, and it could also change course tomorrow. So everything argued against Palantir could also be argued against IBM, except for the Peter Thiel's political image. So there is no evidence that Gotham reflects Thiel's personal ideology. This part of the debate is about political anxiety, not about technological or technical risk. And so the last fear, which is actually real, is dependency. If the US restricts exports, or if Palantir withdrew, the police would lose a tool on which they have come to rely, and that is a real risk. But if you think about it and do a strategic assessment, then two questions matter. How severe would the damage be if this dependency were exploited, and how likely that is to happen? So if Gotham disappears tomorrow, the police would lose an efficiency tool, and some also costs would be lost. They would revert to slower, less automated processes. Some connections might be missed by humans, which analyze them manually, may be found later. But confidential data would not suddenly be leaked to the United States. The damage would be operational, not existential. It would be reversible. And how likely is it that the United States would deliberately exploit this dependency against Germany? This is very hard to qualify and to quantify. But given that the United States is a constitutional state with legal system and values that significantly overlap with those of Germany, that probability is low. So that makes the United States more reliable than most other countries or many other countries. And another issue is the conclusion from this. So dependence on Gotham creates some risk, but it is limited and manageable. And if Europe if Europe decides to build a European alternative, and there are European alternatives, it is a legitimate economic question. But it's not a grand test of digital sovereignty. What the Palantir debate really reveals is a decision-making problem. We devote enormous political energy to a relatively minor dependency because it is emotionally charged. It is an American software, and it is Peter Thiel, and this is a malicious spy software. So on the other hand, while we argue all of this in Germany, on the other hand, we also quietly accept far more serious dependencies. For instance, a kill switch in Microsoft Windows, it could paralyze Germany's entire digital infrastructure. Another example is F-35 fighters. They depend, the F-35 fighters depend entirely on American decisions about software updates and spare parts. Intelligence services depend directly on US data access through multilateral agreements. So these are vastly more critical and consequential dependencies than the police use of Gotham, and yet they receive far less political attention. So instead of systematic risk assessment, we let narrative and symbolism drive our priorities. But for a serious digital sovereignty strategy, we must reverse this. We must start with risk and impact and then decide where to invest the limited money and talent. Because they are limited, the resources are limited, and we cannot invest in everything and be completely sovereign. So we need strategic thinking about technology policy. We need rational risk assessment. We need to distinguish between risks that genuinely matter and risks that are emotionally troubling. We need to weigh the strategic risk of a dependency against the concrete cost of avoiding it. And priorities should be established through a rational analysis of risks, costs, and benefits, and not driven by emotions and political agendas. And let's now go to the fourth point, which is given this reality, what should Germany's strategy be? In the digital sovereignty debate, the key question is not what must we build ourselves? The key question is, where is it strategically necessary to build our own capabilities? Where should we invest? What should we accept as dependencies? And how should we prioritize our dependencies and what we develop ourselves? And for each major technology domain, we should systematically ask, where do we need to lead? Where do we want to lead? Where do we need to be competitive? And where is good enough acceptable? And where can we simply buy on the world market and not make ourselves? And to answer this, we need a sober analysis of risks, opportunities, and costs. And for every dependency, we have to ask, what are the concrete risks if we do not develop this technology ourselves? What kinds of damage, with what probability to security, to democracy, to resilience and competitiveness will it mean? And what are the positive opportunities if we do invest, like new value chains or export potential or knowledge spillovers? And finally, what are the financial and organizational costs, including the opportunity cost of everything else that then we cannot fund if we invest in this technology? Because we have to prioritize. So only when the sovereignty risk is genuinely high and the upside of domestic capability is substantial and cost effective should we say we must do this ourselves. And otherwise, in all other areas, well-governed dependencies like using foreign cloud services under strict contractual and regulatory safeguards, while also developing European alternatives for truly critical applications, this is not a weakness. This is an expression of strategic choice in a world of limited resources. And this brings us to the fifth point, the obstacles. So why is Germany struggling to execute? understanding what Germany has to do is one thing, but understanding or knowing what Germany has to do is one thing, but understanding why we fail to do it is another. And several structural obstacles, they block execution. So let me maybe highlight four that are on the slide. The research to market gap. First, this commercialization gap. Our universities and institutes, they produce world-class work in computer science and engineering and cybersecurity and in AI, but too often the breakthroughs become products and platforms somewhere else, not in Germany. In Silicon Valley, there is a pipeline from lab to startup to global company. In Germany, the results are published, a few spin-offs appear, but they are undercapitalized and they scale abroad. We lose both economic value and strategic capability, exactly what digital sovereignty is meant to protect. And the reasons are structural and they're solvable. First is risk-averse venture capital, what we also heard previously. Heavy bureaucracy in founding and in hiring. This is also extremely difficult in Germany, and there is a lot of discussions about this. And universities also, they treat entrepreneurship as a distraction, and this has been improving, but this is still a very different situation from the universities in the United States. So what should we do? We should empower universities to support spin-offs. We should create sizable early stage tech funds with real risk tolerance. We should simplify labor and tax rules for young companies. We should accept that startups will fail, and failure is not necessarily a downside. We learn from failure, as we also heard previously.
I just wanted to ask you just to get to the next presentation, try to wrap up in the next few minutes.
Okay, so how much time do I have left?
A couple of minutes just to really conclude.
Yeah, a few minutes.
So we have a talent shortage, and the reasons are education. So our education, and there are a number of reasons. One of them is our education system undervalues MINT or STEM in English. Technical education is often seen as less prestigious. Another is incentives. And also, what was also mentioned is immigration. While it brings benefit, our visa procedures are slow, complex, and recognition of qualifications is cumbersome. Our immigration rules are not designed around the needs of the digital economy, and all of this can be changed. Then another obstacle is federal structure and internal competition. And regulatory challenges and risk aversion, what we also briefly mentioned. So perhaps I will conclude this all. So the Germany's core problem in the digital age is not a lack of talent or resources. It is structural and cultural. Slow digital transformation, risk-averse decision-making, and regulation that protects incumbents more than it enables new entrants. And to improve digital sovereignty, we must focus on a few strategic domains, above all AI, quantum, and other future important technologies. Substantially fund research, attract international talent, build European AI infrastructure, and strengthen venture capital for deep tech startups. At the same time, we need structural reforms. We need to make it easier to fund tech companies. We need to found tech companies. We need to modernize immigration for top talent. We need to coordinate federal tech infrastructure. We need to review regulations against its real costs and invest seriously in computer science education. And ultimately, the question for Germany is simple but not easy. Do we want to help shape the technological future, accept more risk, more speed and more failure, or do we want to remain a careful regulator of technologies developed elsewhere? And this is not a question of capability, it is a question of choice. And I will conclude here.
So let's start with something cute first. I think my two children should be watching this from the UK. So, hi Nico and Sasha. And now I'm going to tell you a story about why it's always been bad. And it's a story initially about the telegraph. So the telegraphy boom of the 1870s occurred in a world dominated by a single power, Britain. It was, of course, a period of relative peace among the major powers between the Napoleonic Wars and the imperial rivalries at the end of the century. The Franco-Prussian War had just been concluded. Germany had just been unified. The American Civil War relatively recently finished. France was a subordinate rival to Britain in global trade and colonies, and it was preoccupied with the German threat. Around about that time, German and American industrial powerhouses both began to take off, but there was still quite a way to go before they could challenge Britain, whose naval power exceeded that of the other countries. And its command of the seas gave it a scattering of landing places for its cables around the world, and its maritime capacities enabled it to connect and defend those cables. So the advanced technology of that time was born into the world of the Pax Britannica and its unified global market, and it became the material bearer of that market, as mostly private British cable companies laid the basis for what were primarily commercial and financial communications on a global level. Those communications enabled economic relations that wouldn't otherwise have been possible. Suddenly one could interact with markets on the other side of the world within hours rather than minutes, or rather than months, rather. These circumstances of its birth rubbed off on popular understandings of what the telegraph was. It was interpreted as this tool of peace and a kind of miraculous kind of unification of the world, of understanding between nations and so on. And there were various diplomatic efforts to have it recognized as something that was neutral and outside of the terrain of conflict, perhaps driven by an awareness that the terrestrial telegraphy had already been militarized in the 1860s in the Franco-Prussian War, when cable cutting and cable laying were involved, and also in the American Civil War, and also in the hinterlands of states and empires in the American West. There was a lot of sabotage of cables. In Iraq, tribes would sabotage cables. In the decaying Qing China, Western attempts at penetrating with telegraph networks were resisted a lot, and the cables were pulled down and so on. But for the most part, the other powers just let British firms get on with connecting the world to this first telecommunications system. France made some efforts to kind of assert itself, but it was starting from a weaker position, and its efforts tended to end up getting swallowed up by Anglo-American capital. Its combination of Atlantic Mediterranean coastlines helped with international connectivity, but even in its colonies, its cable stations tended to be operated by British firms, and thus, in a sense, it was subsidizing British cable dominance. Given that Germany had very few foreign possessions and little naval capacity in the early days, it struggled even more, despite of the fact that it was an early advancer in electricity and so on. And as it grew, it started to really sort of feel a need for more networks in the Americas, especially. The American state, like the British, left it up mostly to private capital to build its infrastructures, and firms were actually often privately owned, partly by British investors and companies, sometimes in secret for strategic reasons, and thus British and American interests were deeply entwined in the Americas, even under kind of Monroe Doctrine policies in that sphere. The British state didn't really intervene very much in its networks, though it certainly saw them as important to its power, and it often lent the companies diplomatic support, and There was a sort of revolving door that developed between the big telegraphy companies and the political sphere. But as the industrial development, particularly in the US and Germany, began to tip over into great power rivalry, it became unavoidable, this strategic geography of the telegraph. It couldn't be ignored. Germany was establishing its own imperial presence in Africa and saw itself as an ally against Britain of the Boer Republic in the Transvaal. At the end of 1895, from the eve of the botched British Jameson raid, telegraphic communications between the two, which were completely dependent on British lines, were interrupted for 2 weeks. The Kaiser's famous telegraph to President Kruger, after congratulating him for repelling the Brits, also had to travel over British lines and was intercepted and published in London newspapers, provoking anti-German sentiment even before it could reach its destination. These events led to outrage in Germany and are seen as a tipping point in the deterioration of relations between the powers. And an early analyst of global networks captured it thus. It was England itself that suddenly sounded the fanfare to an unsuspecting world in the 1890s and repeatedly exploited its almost complete omnipotence in cable control for national political purposes in a manner that was extremely painful for the other European nations. In the event of war, it truly had nothing to fear. All the advantages were on its side. Its cable hegemony allowed it to cut off any opponent from almost all overseas telegraph connections within a few minutes. England's dominance in cable connections slowly opened the eyes of the other powers to the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. Not long after the Second Boer War, Britain introduced censorship on communications between the Afrikaners and Europe and banned encryption to much protest. As a contemporary German study of global cable networks at the time put it, England remains the center where all major lines of overseas telegraph traffic converge. In other words, all important commercial and political news is known in England 2 to 3 hours earlier than on the continent. One need only say this to realize what a colossal advantage it gives the English commercial world over its competitors in international traffic. Likewise, the English government has a significant lead over all other powers in all measures it takes in response to sudden complications. This is in 1903. France had similar grievances. In 1893, for example, the government authorization to French forces to issue an ultimatum to Siam was held up by the Eastern Telegraph Company while the British cabinet had a chance to read it. In 1898, British cable dominance enabled Lord Kitchener to beat a rival French expedition in the Sudan, while France was not quite as dependent as Germany, it was still at strategic risk, particularly in the years before the Entente Cordiale soothed relations. One French commentator lamented that all cables connecting Europe to North America, except for the single French cable, are British or land in Britain. Nothing protects cables laid between territories at war. The whole of Europe could thus be deprived of any means of communicating with America if the French cable was out of service. I believe there's no clearer demonstration of the dependence in which all countries find themselves today with regard to the English telegraph monopoly. Mirand, who at that time was the Minister of Posts and Telegraphs, was disillusioned about any idea that there could be a full catch-up, but nonetheless thought something needed to be done. While the cable has now become an important element of defence, it's never ceased to be an instrument of political influence and a valuable aid to commerce. The British government has understood this perfectly. It's done everything in its power to promote the organisation and development of the vast network on which the world depends. Certainly be reckless to think today of supplanting our neighbours or even equaling them. However, can we not ask ourselves whether there is not something to be done, whether the possession of a colonial domain does not allow us to do so? 1900. Obvious resonances with the current situation. Meanwhile, when the US took its opportunity against Spain in the context of Cuban independence struggles, the seizure of cables to Havana and attempts to cut communications with Spain were prominent tactics of war. The occupying army laid its own networks as it proceeded through the island, and a missed telegram about fuel supplies to the Spanish fleet was seen as a turning point in the loss of the empire's last possessions. The historian Daniel Hedrick has termed this concatenation of events, Boer War, the thing in Sudan I mentioned, and this the Spanish-American War, the cable crisis. In this climate, there was a second cable boom, this time driven by strategic and political concerns, as well as economic. Cable possessions were now seen as a question of sovereignty and might. Mid-century understanding of the telegraph as a tool of peace or a neutral platform for commerce had proven an illusion. Rival powers strove to establish their own sovereign infrastructures. Britain in particular developed its famous all-red line around the planet, connecting its colonial possessions back to London, landing only on British terrain. At the same time, radio was emerging as a potential alternative. Marconi's first business successes were in selling radio to the British Navy and in commercial shipping, enabling communications at sea where cable wasn't an option. His monopolistic practices and the military uptake of the radio helped to spur the industry in Germany, which recognized that radiotelegraphy could be strategically important if it had a war with Britain, in spite of the fact that anyone within range could listen to radio. We see the first glimmerings of what would later be called signals intelligence in these years as states started to think about how to use networks to gather intelligence and how to protect their own sensitive communications. Businesses too would use ciphers and codes for secrecy and economy, but encryption was naturally viewed with some suspicion by authorities. In the First World War, before American entry, Germany had to use US lines to communicate with the Americas. This enabled British cryptanalysts to obtain and decrypt a message proposing to Mexican President Carranza an alliance against the United States. The Zimmerman telegram, as it became known, was leaked to the American press and was one of the crucial events leading Woodrow Wilson to declare war against Germany. It'd take another world war to topple Britain from its perch, but even then the cryptographic practices developed in its years of dominance over international communications proved central to Allied strategy. Through the war, US and UK cryptanalysis efforts became increasingly integrated and professionalized, laying the bases for the post-war Five Eyes arrangements and the establishment of permanent institutions such as the NSA and GCHQ. As the US became the new hegemon, global communications came increasingly under its sway. The old telegraphic empire now was incorporated as a subordinate partner. So now another story about how it's always been bad. About the internet this time. So the internet boom of the late 90s occurred in a world dominated by a single capitalist power, the United States. It was, of course, a period of peace among major powers after the end of the Cold War. Although it was from around this time the Chinese industrial powerhouse began to take off, there was still some way to go before it could challenge the United States, whose military power far exceeded those of other countries. This power was built on an industrialization of military technology that could be traced back to the Civil War and the development of complex high-tech communication and computation systems. In spite of its Cold War military origins, the global rollout of the internet occurred at the height of the Pax Americana and its unified global marketplace, whose material bearer it quickly became, as mostly private US companies laid the basis for commercial, financial, and general social communications on a global level. These communications enabled economic relations that would not otherwise have been possible. One could now interact in real time with markets, organizations, and people on the other side of the world at very low costs. The circumstances of its birth rubbed off on popular interpretations of the internet, which was in its early days often seen as an instrument of global community transcending the bounds of an outdated territorial political system. There have been various efforts since its birth to depoliticize key parts of internet infrastructure. For example, ICANN, which governs the allocation of IP addresses via IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, began under contract with the United States Department of Commerce in 1998. As the internet became more important globally in the 2000s, some states became uneasy about this close association with the US government. Pressure mounted via the UN for so-called multi-stakeholderism and an internationalization of its governance. In 2016, this led to the conversion of IANA into a US non-profit when its contract with the Department of Commerce expired. But for the most part, other powers just let American firms get on with deepening the world's connections. France maintained an important but subordinate position in the networking of the world, with firms like Orange and Alcatel among the handful laying and maintaining global fiber optic infrastructure. France's combination of coastlines on the Atlantic and Mediterranean helped to make it a path of international connectivity. While majority French owned, probably for national security reasons, a large part of the shares in these companies were held by big American investors like BlackRock, via Nokia in the case of Alcatel. American investors also owned some of the connections to France's overseas territories, though the ownership structures of such cables were quite internationalized. Germany played little role on this level outside its own territory, though its position within Europe did mean it hosted some of the most important internet exchanges via which international traffic would flow. Britain, meanwhile, maintained its function as an offshore base and relay of American power in this sphere, both in communications and finance, constituting an important but essentially dependent route between Europe and the Americas. The United States didn't intervene much in the networks its firms were creating, though they were certainly seen as important to its power, were often lent diplomatic support. Indeed, something of a revolving door developed between big internet companies and the political sphere. But as industrial development began to tip over into great power rivalry with the takeoff of China, the strategic geography of the internet could not be ignored. China had begun to take serious measures to toughen its internet security and censorship as early as the late 90s with the Golden Shield project, with support from Western firms, including Cisco. But it began to develop more ambitious infrastructural policies, both internal and international, towards the end of the 2000s, later to be dubbed the Belt and Road Initiative and Digital Silk Road. With the so-called Great Firewall and various reported cases of authoritarian uses of the internet globally, a certain discourse about the balkanization of the internet developed around this time. The universal good of the open internet risked splintering into so many national versions. Evgeny's first book is an exemplar of that moment in the discourse. A strange presentation by an Oracle employee to the US Homeland Security Subcommittee during the early Obama, oh yeah, I missed that slide. During the early Obama years, kind of captured some of the ideological torsions of that time, simultaneously arguing for a global cyber commons and a cyber Monroe doctrine, defending US interests from other powers in the sphere. Since the value of the internet is driven by network effects, policies that decrease the value of the internet through balkanization will harm all participants. While a cyber Monroe doctrine can identify specific critical cyber infrastructure of interest to the US, parts of the cyber infrastructure are critical to all global stakeholders. Ensure even if the United States may have a cyber sphere of influence, there are nonetheless cyber commons. There's this complicated interplay of kind of universality and particularity here, where they're both kind of very awkward, not really reconciling to each other. It seems to me an expression of a hegemon beginning to struggle with justifying its place in the world, a world that had been heavily cloaked in this discourse of internet commons and the global good of the internet. So if the geopolitical and economic ground was already starting to shift well before, it was of course the Snowden revelations that would come to symbolize the end of the early cyber utopianism and a shift into a new moment. Responses of the US's main geopolitical rivals, China and Russia, were of course rather cynical. Neither had clean hands, of course, and both had been subjected to a lot of Western moralizing about internet freedom. So here's Putin. How do I feel about Obama after Snowden's revelations? I envy him because he can do this without incurring any consequences. And then around the same time from the Chinese Ministry of Defense, the Prismgate affair reveals the true face and hypocritical conduct regarding internet security of the country concerned. It again reminds us we must attach even more importance to internet and information security. On the one hand, abuse one's advantages in information technology for selfish ends, while on the other, making baseless accusations against other countries. Those double standards that will be of no help for peace and security in cyberspace. How did the major European states react to revelations that the NSA had been wiretapping their leaders, not to mention surveilling their populations? Merkel and Hollande gave Obama a couple of performative tellings off. Merkel said she was severely shaken. Words will not be sufficient. True change is necessary. We need trust. Spying among friends is never acceptable, no matter in what situation. Hollande, almost like they agreed on what to say together, said unacceptable between friends and allies, the privacy of French citizens was at stake, and he demanded explanations. Of course, Obama responded by acknowledging legitimate concerns and trying to essentially deflect in a rather kind of weak way. So the weakness of these protestations was perhaps due to the fact that both was surely well aware there's a long history of spying between allies at governmental level. What was new here wasn't the wiretaps, it was the vast scale of the internet surveillance. Their weakness, perhaps, though, was also the weakness of vassal states within the NATO system. The British, for their part, mostly contented themselves with attacking the press for leaks, Britain performing as it usually does the role of loyal lieutenant. Perhaps the greatest real shift to come out of this crisis was just the fact that the US tech firms worried about their reputations led a kind of general turn towards encryption online. Nonetheless, there was a real shift in technology discourse from around this time, and there resulted various attempts within Europe to address the problem in the normal way, having the Commission propose new regulations, some of which we've already discussed. GDPR was a product of that moment, really, which changed forever the way that companies handle email newsletter signups and cookie pop-ups. As always with these things, there was a huge compliance upheaval for everything from the tiniest organization up to the giant corporations, but for the most part, the concentration of power and resources in the US firms that were kind of the target was largely unaffected. And I think we have to see that concentration of material resources and power as the underlying problem under the thing that appears in the avatar of privacy concerns. Further regulation followed the Cybersecurity Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Network and Information Systems Regulations 1 and 2, over the period since sort of 2016, between then and 2022 and up to the present. An internet sovereignty and cloud sovereignty agenda started to develop with the goal of establishing more sovereign infrastructures in Europe. Gaia X being an example, initially a Franco-German effort to assert ourselves in the world. In German Economy Minister Peter Altmaier's words, it quickly degenerated into organizational chaos, and it soon emerged that none other than Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Palantir, Huawei, and Alibaba were full members of Europe's flagship sovereign internet project. Macron was at least somewhat realistic. Will we have a fully sovereign cloud in 5 years? No, I don't think so, because we're lagging far behind, and because the difference in investment between Europe and the US is a factor of 10 among private players. So I think let's look at some maps on what European technological sovereignty looks like at present. So it's got as dense a concentration of internet connections as you'll find anywhere in the world, and similarly of internet exchanges. And the distribution of these broadly corresponds to the population you would expect. However, when we look at cloud infrastructure, which also broadly corresponds to the distribution of population, it's almost all, well, the majority is American owned. There's a fair share that's Chinese owned, a tiny bit that's French, and what's more, a preponderance of the installations that we can see on this map are mere on-ramps, which are just high-speed connections to resources that are actually held elsewhere. 5 minutes. Yeah. Okay. And what's more, the US 2018 Cloud Act gives the American state access rights to the data of US companies, even when stored outside of the US. Perhaps the most plausible initiatives to address this, if depressing so far, are the Cloud de Confiance grants, which sort of aim to fudge the jurisdictional problems of the Cloud Act with local firms handling data storage, even if they work with Google and so on. The question of technological sovereignty can only really be posed properly in the context of sovereignty itself. So what is left of Europe's sovereignty? That sovereignty, such as it is a strange contraption forged in French post-war efforts to contain the German threat by pooling some sovereignty in a way that would prove mutually constraining, combined with American efforts to bind Europe's states firmly into an alliance against the Soviet Union. This kind of what Americans might call a Rube Goldberg device has judded on, accruing new territories and functions along the way, often to US bidding. It's almost entirely lacking in popular sovereignty, which is contained by the usual national organs of democracy. What national sovereignty there is acts as a check on the supranational, which tends to be reduced to its monetary and regulatory functions, and on the sovereignties of other states in the Union. French sovereignty checks German, German checks French, and tramples Greek. At a continental level, it may be viewed as an elaborate system for the mutual limitation of sovereignty, and NATO keeps it all in check. Gray down there, this is a quote from Gray. He can come in on the questions if you like. By design, not flaw, NATO has effectively limited the exercise of sovereignty on the part of its constituent publics, insulating existential decisions over war and peace from the hurly-burly of electoral politics. Still, the years after the Snowden revelations have seen a real disenchantment with this kind of integration into American power on the part of European publics. Calls for a European technological sovereignty may be read as symptomatic of this. Meanwhile, after the Eurozone crisis, that German center of gravity, which is always kind of latent, at least in Europe, did seem to be kind of emerging, this sense of a German Europe centered on the engine of Europe. In itself, Germany had long had an interest in keeping peace with its neighbors to the east, which sometimes bumped up against NATO barriers. But then Russia invaded Ukraine. According to Wolfgang Streeck, the war seems to have dealt a death blow to the French dream of turning the liberal empire of the European Union into a strategically sovereign global force, credibly rivaling both a rising China and a declining United States. The Russian invasion of Ukraine seems to have answered the question of the European order by reinstating the model of the Cold War, a Europe united under American leadership as a transatlantic bridgehead for the United States in an alliance against a common enemy. So we began with weaponization of infrastructure, and we'll end there. In September 2022, of course, the newly expanded NordStream pipelines carrying natural gas from Russia to Germany were sabotaged. Most Western journalists, credulous or cynical, of course, blamed Russia, but this was a counterintuitive accusation in political and economic terms. Recently, it's been coming to light that it seems to have been a Ukrainian operation. If so, it's hard to imagine it being undertaken without tacit approval of NATO powers at minimum. The upshot of the war has, of course, been a shock to the German economy, suddenly forced to reorient to new energy sources while the NATO umbrella keeps it safe and keeps it in check. Once again, in this context, prospects for a sovereign Europe at the level of technology or anything else seem more remote than ever. We can end with a quote from Tom Meany. NATO's largely fulfilled the mission of its first Secretary General, Hastings Ismay, to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down.